Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural professorial lecture of Professor Anwar Bég. I'm Carl Dayson, and I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise here at the University of Salford. It's my honour to invite Professor Bég to deliver his lecture today. Anwar was born in Dewsbury, Yorkshire, home of Tom Kilburn, Britain's first Professor of Computer Sciences, who worked on Manchester Baby and the Ferranti Mark I, the first commercial computer. Anwar was brought up in Failsworth and attended the local comprehensive school. It was here that his love for physics developed due to an inspirational science teacher who told him the human mind is like a parachute. It's best when it's open. In 1988, he started his four-year undergraduate degree at Manchester University, graduating in 1992. Having spent his student years during the height of the Manchester, I asked Anwar what he recalls of that time. Anwar adopted the Las Vegas defence. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas when questioned. He subsequently undertook a PhD in engineering, magnetohydronics from Manchester University in 1996, with a focus on magnetic boundary layers. As he went through the formal education, Anwar developed a passion for complexity and multiphysics, where more than one physical reaction occurs. The problem is that trying to do more than one reaction at a time in a laboratory is difficult, which is where computational methods come in to solve those engineering problems. He described the challenge as follows. Imagine an aircraft flying at altitude. The water molecules on the wings start to freeze as the plane rises, but as it descends, it melts and begins to penetrate the plastic coating on the wings. This negatively affects the safety of the aircraft. Clearly, that would be quite a dangerous experiment. Instead, they recreate in a computer simulation and test which interventions work. After graduating, he worked for 5 years in industry, from 1996 until 2001, in computational mechanics simulations and special projects, including roller coaster vibration, fire propagation modelling, flame dynamic computation, nuclear reactor seismic design, BAE London ice structural analysis, ocean wave dynamics for offshore platforms, naval propulsion, and photovoltaic facade modelling. 2001 was when Anwar met his future wife Kush, and in March they will celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary. Congratulations to them both. They share their home with 11 cats, although at one point they did have 17. Following his time in industry, he held academic roles at Leeds Metropolitan University, Sheffield Hallam, University College Centre, Wakefield, before becoming a lecturer in fluid mechanics and computational fluid dynamics here at Salford in 2016. He established the Multiphysical Engineering Sciences Group in Mechanical Engineering in 2019, the year in which he received his professoriate. Anwar has been a prodigious producer of outputs, with approximately 600 journal papers and 50 conference papers in his career, including over 60 with colleagues at Salford University and over 250 journal papers since joining Salford. Anwar's H-index is one of the highest in engineering, at 61, and his work has received over 15,000 citations. He is ranked #1 in the world on Google Scholar in multiphysics, mass transport, micropolar fluid dynamics, thermal fluids, and biological fluid mechanics. Anwar has published several books on magnetofluid dynamics in 2011, micropolar fluid dynamics in 2010, and also the history of engineering science in 2003, and many book chapters on electromagnetic propulsion, biofuel, solar nano collectors, etc. He has, in the past 6 years, introduced new research themes in computational fluid dynamics, nanofluid dynamics, electromagnetic lubrication, hybrid energy, robotic swimming, coating simulation, and medical fluid dynamics. He works closely with many international research groups, including the USA Air Force Institute of Technology on aerothermomechanics and nanopropulsion, the University of Sands in Malaysia on electromagnetic pumping and nanotribiology, and the National Institute of Technology India on electro-osmotic microfluidic device and smart tribiology lubricant simulation. He has been the UK editor for the journal Mechanics and Medicine and Biology since 2010, coordinating contributions in multiphysical bioheat transfer, mass transfer, peristaltic flows, computational blood flows, etc. His most recent work involves Taylor's dispersion in pharmacological transport, hydrodynamic stability of interfacial flows in polymer manufacture, bio-inspired pumps for rocket fuel combustion, hybrid electrofuel cells, bio-nano coatings, and gas turbine thermofluid structure interaction. When not working, Anwar enjoys the great outdoors, especially woodland, and reading science fiction, and in his words, today's fantastical is tomorrow's science fact. His other passion is cricket. Growing up, he captained his school team and played for Oldham Town team. Anwar was an all-rounder, batting at 4 and a fast bowler to boot. We could have done with Anwar during the Ashes, I feel. Being a proud Yorkshireman, his batting hero was Sir Len Hatton, yet it was Dennis Lillee who inspired his bowling prowess. To be honest, I'd be glad if I never see another Aussie fast bowler for the rest of my life. And here we are today, Professor Anwar Bég's inaugural professorial lecture. Just before we get started, I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the lecture, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions. To do so, just type your question in the Q&A on the right-hand side of your screen. As time allows, Anwar will address as many questions as he can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We will be recording this session and will share the link after the event. With all that said, over to you, Anwar. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you all for attending. As Carl mentioned, the focus of my lecture today is computational simulation in multiphysical fluid dynamics. And what I'll try to do in this lecture is review the kind of work we've done at Salford specifically over the last 6 years, both at undergraduate, at postgraduate, and also postdoctoral level, and also with my own research interfacing with international bodies. So just to share the screen again with you very quickly. I'll start off with just a summary of what it means to work at Salford University. I mean, the university motto is Altiora Patamus. My Latin is not something to boast about, but this means in English, let us seek higher things. Now, within Salford, you'll all be aware there are hundreds, if not thousands, of businesses. We're living in a global culture, but there's only one university. This gives us a very unique position in Salford and also in Greater Manchester and wider afield to develop intellectual pursuits. And this has been what we've tried to gravitate around, certainly in the small group that I've developed, in pushing the intellectual pursuits, which will eventually develop into commercial interests. So here we'll give you some examples of the kinds of things we've tried to do. There's the coat of arms of Salford for those who are familiar with it. The presentation will comprise roughly about 5 sections. And just to summarize, computational multiphysical fluid mechanics, which is a bit of a mouthful, really crosses many boundaries. But the 3 principal areas that I've worked in, certainly in the last 6 years, are aerospace, which includes both aeronautical and more specifically astronautical. So we are seeking higher things because we're going higher in terms of altitude, if you forgive the pun. Also energy, which is an important indicator of the global economy now. Things like renewables, and the 2-year pandemic that we've all been witness to, and has sadly cost almost 160,000 lives, also brings to bear the importance of medical engineering, how engineers can contribute to the medical field. Now, what unifies these 3 disciplines in one sense is materials, because they all exploit some form of material and also involve technologies that have to be manufactured. That involves materials processing. But what we'll try to do over the next 45-50 minutes is give you some examples of how we've achieved this at Salford with novelty, and on top of that, how we've integrated the learning at undergraduate level, because they're the future postgraduates, consolidated at MSc level, taking it to doctoral level, and then wider afield with colleagues who are parts of the group, like Dr. Leonard, Dr. Kadir, Dr. Waleed Juri, Dr. Larissa Malisheva, and newly appointed Dr. Ganapathy and Dr. Siritorn. So I'll give you 4 examples that I'll cover all those levels of endeavour. And I've tried to embed a few animations in as well to make it a bit more visual. And on top of that, we'll also mention things like curriculum development, how we've embedded this kind of research in the learning of our students, because this is a very, very important part of what we do as researchers. Yeah, the research of today is really the learning of tomorrow, and it gets embedded in the curriculum, and we interface with institutions like the Royal Aeronautical Society, the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and then to communicate the ideas, yes, for the benefit of humanity, wider afield. One has to publish in books or journals or present at conferences. So we'll give you some examples of that. And you have to appreciate that, as Carl mentioned in his introduction, I've produced over 600 journal papers, but I've only selected maybe 5 or 10 examples just to give you a flavor of what's going on. And I've kept them visual, and I've minimized the mathematics because it is quite difficult, and it's taken me the best part of 30 years to learn this kind of science. So I've tried to keep it as visual and as user-friendly as possible. So I hope you appreciate that. I'll finish off with just a few indications of the sort of current areas we're looking at, which are laser-assisted nanobiomechanics, the very small scale, 10 to the -9. We're not talking about a billionth of a meter. And then also recent achievements in drug delivery, because pharmacology obviously became increasingly important during the COVID pandemic. And the vaccine that was developed has also stimulated a lot of scientists like myself to work in that field. So without further ado, let's move on. A quick summary of the legacy of Salford. Yeah, some of you may be aware of James Joule. Joule House is on the Crescent opposite the Peel building. Approximately 100 to 120 years ago, he was the most famous multiphysicist on planet Earth. And he actually pioneered the law of conservation of energy, and he's shown there in the center. And the unit Joule is named after him. Every human being at some stage in their life will obviously eat cereals. If you look at the back of a Kellogg's packet, you'll see the unit Joule. This is how important this individual was to the development of modern science and multiphysics in particular. But there were also other individuals who I found inspiring. For example, Sidney Chapman, who wrote an excellent book called The Mathematical Theory of Non-Uniform Gases. He was actually an undergraduate student at Salford over 100 years ago, and then he moved on to become the Bayer Professor of Applied Maths at Manchester and later to Imperial College. But he was a pioneer in gas dynamics, which is part of aerodynamics. And we also had Sir John Harold Horlock, who at one time was the greatest gas turbine designer in the world, and later became a professor of mechanical engineering at Cambridge. He was the vice chancellor at one stage of Salford. And also Sir John Ashworth, who was a pioneering developmental biologist. And it was through reading his work, not just when he was at Salford, but prior to that when he was at Essex, on molds and bacterial slimes, that got me interested in bio-inspired engineering. So all these individuals have actually contributed in one way or another to the type of work that we're doing at Salford today, and I hope they would have been proud of what we've achieved. At the moment, what is multiphysics in the 21st century at Salford? Well, there's 5 members of the small group that we created called Multiphysical Engineering Sciences Group. A good colleague, Dr. Leonard, who teaches thermodynamics, Dr. Jury, who specializes in composites and structures, Dr. Kadir, who later will be accepting questions during the Q&A session with you, myself, and then a new PhD completion, Dr. Kohara, who's joined the group now and has been with us for about 6 months, but has been a student at Salford for 10 years. So together, we try to cover as much as we can in terms of complexity and diversity within multiphysics, which you'll appreciate a little bit more when I explain exactly what it is that we do. So without further ado, what actually is multiphysics? Well, as the title implies, it involves physics, but multiple things happening at the same time. So any student of A-level physics will appreciate there are different topics like thermodynamics, which involves heat doing work, heat transfer, which involves the transmission of heat from a hot place to a cold place. It occurs everywhere on the planet. At the moment, it's very important in climate modeling. There's also electromagnetic fields, electrical fields and magnetic fields, which kind of move like a snake at orthogonal directions to each other, but they coexist. And the nature of multiphysics is that many things often flow. So you may have different kinds of fluids. You'll have chemical reactions, which brings chemistry into it. You'll have acoustics, which involves vibrations and sound propagation. And then you'll also have things like structures, material deformation, rigid bodies and stuff like that. So what multiphysics does is it unifies these disciplines, but not necessarily all at the same time. So it's a bit like going to ASDA and pick and mix. You can combine, for example, electromagnetic fields with structural mechanics to do magnetostructural mechanics, or you can combine chemical reactions with fluid flow, which is very important, obviously, in combustion and burn science to do with jet engines and fire dynamics. If you want to look at things like combustion reactions. So it's a bit of a pick and mix thing, and it's very rare that all the multiphysics will come together, although there are some problems where every single orange bubble on that diagram we have addressed, but we've done it in multiple stages. So the underlying science obviously is mathematics. That's the language of physics and science generally. So it tends to be very analytical in nature. So I hope that gives you an idea of what we're talking about. Without trying to scare anybody, these are the kinds of equations that we have to look at. So just to quickly summarize again, you've got the famous equations, Navier-Stokes three-dimensional unsteady flow equations, and these are partial differential equations because you have more than one space variable, x, y, and z. Look at my hand, you might have three directions. Time is also the fourth dimension, so you'll see time there as well. But the fluid doesn't necessarily have to be water or air. There are very complex fluids that exist in nature, the most challenging of which is actually human blood. It's the most complex fluid I've had to deal with in my life, and it cannot be simulated with using this model. You have to use non-Newtonian equations. So you have to extend the ideas of the great Isaac Newton, who the Newton building is named after, which is where we all work in mechanical and aero engineering, to cater for special characteristics that you only see in things like chocolate, which is very viscous, honey, blood, polymers, plastics, greases, lubricants. These are all non-Newtonian fluids, and they're very, very complex to model. It's a subject in its own right. On top of that, you've got electromagnetic fields, which are the famous Maxwell equations. And I'll mention Maxwell a little bit later in the presentation. The main building, as you enter the University of Salford, opposite the Crescent, is actually called the Maxwell Building in honor of this great scientist, who arguably is the world's first multiphysicist. So you have to look at magnetic fields or electrical fields. When you combine magnetism with fluid flow, you get the science of magnetohydrodynamics. The fluid actually conducts electricity. This was verified by another great scientist, Faraday, Michael Faraday, in around 1830s in London, when he did an experiment on the Thames River. He actually proved that because of the salt content, it conducts electricity. This gave birth to a massive discipline known as MHD, magnetohydrodynamics. And around the same time, the German scientist Roos discovered electrohydrodynamics. And these are things that are now filtering into modern aerospace, mechanical, energy and medical engineering. They're taking over. Even smart electric cars are utilizing these ideas. Then we have the laws of thermodynamics. And of course, Joule is very famous for the first law, which is energy can never be created or destroyed. And then he developed the unit called the Joule. There's the entropy law, where you have a natural disorder in the universe. And this is becoming an increasingly important area of thermal optimization, because heat itself is generally very inefficient. The maximum efficiency you can get from a gas turbine is 60%. If you're lucky. Why do we use them? Because air is free. Yeah, we live in a planet which is air rich. So people are now trying to develop technologies where you can optimize the thermal science and get more out of what you're putting in. And to do that, you have to look at the entropy side, which is another branch of physics. Then there's the structural side. Hooke's law, the famous law of materials, where you relate stress to strain by things like Young's modulus, Poisson ratio, and you're looking at things like torsion or twisting. You might bring in St. Venant's modulus. But the heat transfer itself is not just radiative, which is the most complex mode. That's how the sunlight heat reaches us from the sun, travels 93 million miles, traversing space, and it sustains all life on the planet. Without the sun, there is no life on planet Earth. But it's a very complicated area of physics. And you can also have convection, which is how you get hot water. Heat moves in a cup, or conduction, which is why your feet feel cold if you walk barefoot on the tiles in your bathroom in the morning. Heat leaves the body through solid body heat transfer. So all these things can happen. And here we'll just give you some ideas of how we've combined different components of them. in our work at Salford. So how do we actually solve those equations? Well, you can appreciate there are many equations I've shown there. And although mathematicians have pushed the limits as far as they can to get closed form or hand solutions, in the real world, when you have geometric complexity, yeah, for example, this pencil may look simple, but it's actually quite complex. It's got hexagonal structure to it. Yeah, you have to use computational methods, not just for the geometry, but also to cater for the complexity of the physics. So some of the softwares that have been developed to do this kind of work are visualized here. You've got MATLAB, which is very popular with undergraduates in the control and dynamics discipline. We also use it in fluid mechanics. ANSYS is a finite element solver. I'll explain that, in due course. But this can simulate complex geometrical problems, whether they're aerodynamics, fluid mechanics, corrosion science, impact engineering, roller coasters, you name it. As long as you can simulate the geometry, you can bring the physics together, and you can predict things like stresses, strains, velocities, pressures, the things that engineers are interested in optimizing to get a good design. There are also codes like FreeFEM, which is a French software that gives you a little bit more leeway in developing your own user-defined models, because there are materials that are emerging in industry which don't have mathematical models that have already been inbuilt into these softwares, these commercial softwares. You have to write the codes yourselves. So an example of that is micropolar models, which I'll discuss later, on nanofluids, which contain nanoparticles at the billion meter scale. And then this COMSOL multiphysics, which is shown in the bottom right there. So all these methods use computation. So this is why Carl mentioned Tom Kilburn, because without computer science, we cannot do this kind of work. So this is why computation is in the title. It's absolutely critical to the kind of work we're trying to do. Now, how do we actually solve a problem? Well, as I said to you earlier, it's a bit like going to a superstore and picking and mixing different sweets. Yeah, but the basic idea is the same. You first have to define what the problem is. You have to have a physical understanding or appreciation of what you're looking at. So it might be blood flow in the human body. It might be a new green energy system like a photovoltaic cell on a facade. It might be a wind turbine. It might be a novel aircraft wing. It doesn't matter what the system is, as long as you understand and define what you're going to simulate and what part of it you're going to look at. Are you going to look at the structural side? Are you going to look at the fluid side? Are you going to look at both interacting together? Are you going to bring heat into it, vibration into it? You have to define the problem physically first. Once you've done that, that's when you ascribe the mathematics. So the mathematics converts the physical problem into an analytical statement or a mathematical model which tries to represent what the physics is to the best of our ability. And then you can proceed with actually solving that problem. So you need things like data, material properties. You need things like boundary conditions. What's the inlet velocity to a gas turbine blade? What's the oncoming velocity or the flight velocity of an aircraft? What's the impact force on a landing gear when the aircraft's landing on the runway? Or what's the speed of a motor car? It doesn't matter what the problem is. You have to have that data. And that's usually prescribed by virtue of experiments and laboratory testing. So what you do is you define generically what's called a boundary value problem. It's a differential equation system. It's got the maths in there. It's got the physics in there. It's got the data and boundary conditions. And then you can solve that problem with an appropriate numerical method, of which I gave you a few examples earlier, like ANSYS or MATLAB or COMSOL. It doesn't matter what the method is, as long as it's appropriate to the problem you're trying to solve. Now, the final part could be argued to be the most exciting, which is where you visualize the results. So you show nice pictures, contour plots of what physically is going on when you change a particular parameter. That's an important point to get across. Now, over the last 10 to 20 years, I've worked with many different groups. Carl mentioned a few of them in his introduction, but these are largely international, and the different areas we've worked in. So with Dr. Khan, I've been working in hybrid fuel cells and dielectric materials. He's based in Scotland, Robert Gordon University. Another example is Mr. Mohammed El Gendi, a former MSc student who works for Alcan Medical. We've done a lot of work together now in medical engineering simulation. Most recently, COVID. with Professor Ramagala, a very distinguished engineer from the United States. We've worked on nanofluids. He's based at the United States Air Force Institute of Technology, and with various other individuals like Professor Habib in Spain, Professor Tripathi in India, and Professor Uddin in Malaysia, who looked at non-Newtonian flows and corrosion, and also other aspects of electromagnetics. So just to quickly summarize the kind of work we've done in the last 6 years, which is what this presentation is really focused on, is aerospace, energy, and medical engineering. And I've extracted a couple of examples from each just to give you a flavor of the type of work we've done, to share with you the kind of learning that we've tried to develop. But the main areas focus really in aerospace is high temperature, things like nano coatings for gas turbines, which is the research interest of Dr. Kadir, but also we're interested in things like rocket fuel tank sloshing, rocket splashdown. If you've seen the movie Apollo 13, you'll recognize when Tom Hanks descends into the ocean, that kind of thing, but also novel functional materials which respond to their environment. They're intelligent materials. This is what's happening in modern aerospace. In energy, we've looked at non-Newtonian materials processing, solar gel coatings for photovoltaic collectors, geothermal engineering, and also entropy minimization in various branches of green energy. But a big area that we've really begun to mainly focus on since the pandemic has been bio-inspired fluid dynamics, where we're using ideas from biology to improve engineering systems, but we're also modeling biological systems as they are, things like blood flow through the heart or kneecap injuries, things like that. So the 4 examples that I'll share with you, you'll appreciate, I could have selected from over 600. All were published in journals, so it's a very small snapshot of what we've done, not just at Salford, but in my entire career. But they're quite generic in the sense that the approach is similar, but different aspects of multiphysics have been used, and they've all been inspired by real problems. So the first case I'll look at is the water ingress problem, which Carl mentioned, to do with ice melting and how it penetrates composites, because increasingly aircraft engineers are using composites. Then I'll quickly mention the bio-inspired peristaltic pumps, which is where you're using an idea from swallowing, how the human being swallows through the esophagus, to propel liquid. It's the most efficient mechanism for internal fluid propulsion known in nature, and it's being used by NASA at the moment in designing rocket turbo fuel pumps. Then we'll mention things like magnetic blood flow control, where you impose an external magnetic field. It's called biomagnetic therapy, and this can help patients who have weaknesses in their arteries, and it can save their lives. And then finally, we'll look at a smart functional coating problem, for the naval industry, where we've used a novel design from California, an electromagnetic non-Newtonian polymer known as a hydrogel, and how it's manufactured. So I've tried, as I've said, to keep the mathematics to the bare minimum, but I apologize in advance if the mathematics is a bit hard. So starting with the first problem, which is aircraft elevator moisture ingress. Anyone who's ever flown in an aircraft knows that the commercial aircraft can fly at 25 to 30,000 feet in altitude. That's where the temperature drops, so ice builds up significantly. Now, this alters the aerodynamics of the wing and also other parts of the aircraft. So often engineers think about only the wings, but one has to remember at the tail of the aircraft, you've got things like rudders, elevators, stabilizers. These are critical to the stability of the aircraft, and often ice builds up here rapidly. So this is a very dangerous issue because it not only affects the aerodynamics, but it can damage the control mechanisms in the aircraft, and pilots have to compensate for this. So this is what inspired our study in this area. And I'll quickly share with you an animation just to give you a flavor of what actually happens. If you just bear with me. Here's a quick aviation animation showing you how ice actually builds up on an aircraft. And you can see that even a small aircraft like this, ice accretion is developing very quickly and is building up in specific parts. This affects the aerodynamic profile, but it also affects the structural integrity of the materials that are being used, because when it melts, the ice, when you descend, it penetrates into the composites. There's a quick example there. I'll just unshare that and go back to the presentation, if you just bear with me. So back to the presentation. So just to move on. This gives you an example of the kinds of ice buildup that can occur in these kinds of systems. Different types of icing can be built up, and it affects the different kinds of composites that are being used. I'll just maximize the screen. Yeah. So you can see here clearly that it's a significant problem. And there's an example of the Boeing 757. But what was our motivation? Our motivation is basically to try to simulate as realistically as we can what is actually happening to a component on the aircraft. We chose the elevator, and here you have multiphysics, because not only do you have airflow around the elevator, as can be seen here, you've obviously got airflow around it, but also you've got water penetrating inside the composite, which is a different fluid. And you've also got the structural composite matrix itself. So these three things are occurring at the same time in real time. And the easiest way to simulate this is with finite element methods. So this is why we've chosen that particular example. And this is our geometric model of the elevator. So this is what we're looking at, this section here, and this is the geometric model in a software ANSYS. And then we have to use a particular methodology to solve the problem. So the way to think about it is that, just to jump back, the real system is very large. It's infinite, you could say. What we do is we break it down into small components, tiny components, a bit like tiling a floor. And that's what you see here. So although this is an example to do with automobiles, and if you're looking at the airflow around it, you break up the air system, the air volume or area into very small components, and then you reassemble them using finite element or finite volume theory. So this is how you geometrically model the problem. Once you've done that, you have to solve the problem. That's just the geometry known as pre-processing. You have to solve it, and to do that you use matrix theory. So the numbers are compiled in special arrays known as matrices. Thousands and thousands of equations have to be solved. So you convert differential equations into algebraic equations. And then you get the nice pretty pictures at the end of it, which is called post-processing. So this three-stage process. So the multiphysics for this particular problem was Navier-Stokes equations, which you can see are formidable equations. No one in the world has ever solved them analytically, and it's not likely that they will. Yeah, but you use numerical or computer methods to do this. Then also you introduce mass transfer, because you have a separate fluid, which is the water. As the phase is changing from ice to water, it's melting, it penetrates into the composite. Then you have the properties of the composites. Yeah, epoxy CFRP, 70% fibers, or Kevlar aramid CFRP. There are different materials that are used in the aerospace industry. But once the two things interact, so you've got water penetrating inside the composite, and the composite is being stressed. So you've got a fluid problem and you've got a structural problem happening in real time at the same time. This is why it's called fluid structure interaction, and is an example of multiphysics. So the algorithm that's used in ANSYS, you compute your velocities, then you compute the stresses. Then the stresses affect the velocities, and it goes to and fro until it converges and you get a solution. So what kind of solution are we looking at? Well, first we had to build a mesh, make sure that the mesh, the number of elements was correct, was giving us the right answer. This is known as mesh independence. Then we had to prescribe different kinds of meshing times. So this is all part and parcel of how simulation is done. And then we produce the results. So here you can see the three-dimensional simulation of the elevator. And this is undergraduate work, by the way. This was developed from an undergraduate project that I supervised. So this is static structural deformation. And here on the left-hand side, you have velocity contours. So you have a real 3D body. You have holes in it as well where it's fastened. And then you can introduce the ice through penetration when it's melting and it enters as water. And you'll find, just to summarize, that when you use three different kinds of composites, you get three different patterns in the water ingress. You don't get the same prediction. Now, to do this kind of test in the laboratory would take months, if not years. The benefit of CFD, or computational fluid dynamics, and computational simulation is that you don't run it in real time. You use artificial time on your computer, and it can save you months and months and months of grief. And this is one of the benefits. And you can visualize multiple scenarios again and again. So if you want to redo the simulations, you just go back and change the data. You don't have to go into a laboratory and redo everything from scratch. So what we showed in this work, which incidentally won the Royal Aeronautical Society Teddy Fielding Prize for the student that did it with my supervision in 2016-17, was that epoxy carbon fiber reinforced polymer is the best choice, but it's not being used by all the manufacturers at that stage, and we've recommended it to them. So that's an example of one example of how to do multiphysics. Next, we'll look at excuse me, bio-inspired engineering. So what does this actually mean? Well, in a nutshell, what it means is copying nature. Human beings have been flying since the Wright brothers with powered flight for just over a century. I think it was around 1903 in Ohio. But birds and other mammals and insects have been flying for millions of years. So they're obviously better at it than we are. We can learn much by studying nature. So this is what the whole subject of bio-inspired engineering means. Studying nature, identifying very efficient mechanisms or techniques that we can mimic in our engineering discipline. So a quick example of that is the human bone. It's the most efficient composite known to humanity. It supports a human body through the spine and through the femoral bones and all the other parts of the body. There are 206 bones in the body, and it can last for up to 70-75 years without serious issues. No other manufactured composite, which is where you combine one material with another in engineering, can match that. It's the same with the human eye. It's the best camera in the world. The human ear, the best acoustic receiver in the world. And there are other mechanisms that we can talk about, things like shark skin, which is now being used increasingly in inspiring aircraft wing design because it's got properties that the artificial materials we use just can't match. So this is what bio-inspired engineering is about, taking ideas from nature. So in this example, what we did is, excuse me, we looked at one particular mechanism, and every human being who obviously has an esophagus or a food pipe, this is how we swallow. So it moves in a rhythmic action. Now, I'll very quickly share an animation with you to show you how this works. It'll only take a few seconds. Wrong animation. Should be able to see it now. Yep. So this is the mechanism that we're talking about. That was an example, a quick example of how peristalsis works. So I'll just share my presentation again with you very quickly. So it's the rhythmic contraction in the human esophagus. And we can use that idea to design novel pumps or smart pumps. And the beauty of that idea is that you don't need working parts and you don't need to maintain the pumps because they naturally lubricate themselves. And this idea is now being adopted in fields as diverse as food processing in the manufacturing industry, robotics for limb motion and mobile robots, and also in the aircraft industry and the spacecraft industry and things like turbo pumps. So it's a multi-physics problem because the geometry is deformable. That's the first point, which is complex wavy wall motion. On top of that, you have non-Newtonian fluids inside, because many of the gels and the fuels that are being used are not water. They have special viscous properties. So that involves fluid mechanics and non-Newtonian fluids. And then because the actual material is deforming as well in the boundaries of the conduit that you're pumping fluid through, then you also have stress analysis. That's why this is a three-dimensional multi-physical type problem. Now, there are other applications of this. For example, how worm robots crawl through the earth. They're obviously inspired by real worms, but also the mechanism by which water is pumped up a tree from the roots to the leaves is known as peristalsis. It's called translocation in plants, so it's a universal phenomenon, and it's extremely efficient, which is why nature uses it. But this is what we did. We were inspired by looking at the Harvard University peristaltic pump. The experimental work was done at Harvard, and we got interested in this in an MSc project, which Mr. Gendy did 5 years ago under my supervision at Salford, and we simulated the problem using ANSYS multiphysics. So this gives you an idea of how you've got a tube that can deform and can pump fluid around in any direction you want. So the basic idea was to geometrically simulate the problem first, so you can see that it's a deformable wall. So this is peristaltic pumping. The fluid is being pumped from one part of the system to another part using wall deformation. It does not involve piston motion at the start of the pump, which is the standard method used in pumping, or pressure dynamics. It just uses the wall deformation. The physics involves mathematics as well, so we have to solve Navier-Stokes equations for fluid flow, which are like Newton's laws of motion and the mass conservation, but we also have to use non-Newtonian models. So the Caro viscosity model is used for pumping blood. Another model is the power law model. And these involve modifications to the existing Newtonian model. You have to simulate the problem as accurately as possible. And we used millions of elements to do this. You can see we went as far as 10 million elements in the simulation. But what we found was that when you get to about 400,000, 500,000, the accuracy is sufficient. The convergence has occurred and we're happy with the results. And then we can study different scenarios. So for example, we can look at velocity distribution, excuse me, for different kinds of models, and then we can visualize what's happening. So this is another very important part of computational multiphysics. It turns the physics and the math into pictures, which allows people, designers, to see physically what is going on. Yeah, it's a little bit like watching a movie, and you can tell by studying these pictures what the best combinations of the different fluids required are, what the rate of pumping should be in terms of deformation of the walls. Should there be sinusoidal waves? Should you use triangular waveforms? Whatever combination you want to do, and you can compare them, the different kinds of materials that are being pumped to design more efficient systems for industry, for specific applications. So I haven't dwelt too much on the actual physics behind it because of shortage of time. I'm just giving you a visual flavor. And here's some more examples of pressure and vorticity. And then close-ups, you can zoom in if you're interested in a particular aspect of the problem. And what we found when we compared it to the work that was done by Harvard, the experimental work, is we got very, very close accuracy, which validated the work that we did. It was the first time anyone in the world had ever done this kind of problem with simulation in 3 dimensions for a peristaltic pump. We also showed that the Caro fluid was the best performer, which we recommended to industrial organizations, including Alcan Medical, which is where the person who collaborated with me on this is actually a director now. Now the third example is again to do with medicine, but not necessarily just pumping fluid through pumps, more to do with what's actually happening inside the body. So because the human body contains, has hemoglobin, inside blood cells, the hemo or the iron content responds to magnetic fields. So if you apply an external magnetic field around a human being, and this is also done in nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, which was developed largely by Sir Peter Mansfield, who won the Nobel Prize for it in 2001, you'll find that you can actually manipulate blood flow to your advantage by changing the strength of a magnetic field. So in this particular problem, what we were interested in is a weakness in the arterial wall. And that weakness is known as an aneurysm. What happens if the wall is weak? It can blow up into a balloon. If that balloon suddenly ruptures, the human being can pass away. So it's known as an aneurysmic, sort of a fatality. So we can control the pressure in this because the patient may be 60 to 70 years old. We can control it to our best of our ability by using magnetic fields. And in this particular model, we simulated it first in 2 dimensions. So we had to add the multiphysics of magnetism with fluid mechanics and also heat. When you eat food, one of the byproducts is heat. It generates heat in the body and the blood can conduct heat, which is why you feel better after eating than you do before usually. So heat transfer was also important in this. So it's a triple multiphysics problem. On top of that, we used nanoparticles, which are now being introduced in medicine to control diseases. So very briefly, this is the simulation we did in FreeFEM. Because the model we used, it was not available in ANSYS or other softwares at Salford. We had to code our own model, which is the Buongiorno MIT model in nanoscale fluid mechanics, and also a viscoelastic model for stress relaxation within the blood, which occurs in the vicinity of these kinds of problems. We used Taylor-Hood triangular elements, and about 48,000 elements were used in that model. And that's the bifurcation there. You can see the blood is flowing in this direction, and the artery splits into 2, and the saccular aneurysm, as it's called, the balloon shape, is on the right-hand side. Now, when you change the magnetic field, after you've obviously done the validation for Newtonian and non-Newtonian flows, and we got very close accuracy with the experiments that were done at Caltech and published in 2006, that confirmed our simulations were very good. Then we looked at things like how does the magnetic field affect the pressure distribution or the velocity distribution, and you can see as you change your Reynolds number, for example, which is what's happening from these plots. So the fluid is moving faster, the velocity distributions are changing. But the main thing we wanted to show was that the temperature also changes if you manipulate the viscosity of the blood. This has a contribution to shear stresses and the mechanical integrity of the aneurysm itself. So we've homed in here on just the temperature patterns, yeah? But the main thing we wanted to share with you is that when you increase the external magnetic field, look what happens to the flow rate. It drops dramatically. Just by an external bracelet, you can change the flow rate near the aneurysm. That means that you can reduce the likelihood, because when the flow rate is high, the chances of that balloon rupturing are much higher. So there are clinical implications to this work, and we proved it using multiphysics. As the field goes up, the volumetric flow rate goes down, and that happens through time. The final example I'll share with you is on advanced magnetic functional coatings. Now, these are special kinds of materials where they have inbuilt properties, so you can manipulate them with external magnetic fields, with external electrical fields. You can even use light. They can become photosensitive, or you can use vibrations, things like acoustics. So this is the latest generation of materials that are being developed. And one of the leading institutions in the world is the California Nanoscience Center, which is based, I believe, in Berkeley and the University of California system. We've also explored this with undergraduate projects and MSc students. So the example I'll share with you, I've been really inspired by these applications. So things like how to coat wind turbine blades so they resist weather damage and last longer, which reduces the costs of maintenance, and also magnetic actuated blades, intelligent materials that are now getting to a level where they're programmable materials. So when I was a young man, one of the big movies that came out was Terminator 2 in 1991, and it literally blew everybody's socks off. It's a milestone in cinematic CGI because it introduced the T-1000, which is a shape-shifting, morphing liquid metal robot. And this is the level that materials has actually progressed to as we speak. This is what's coming out now in science. So what we're trying to do is simulate this kind of problem with fluid mechanics. And an example of that is shown here, where you have a cylinder and you're coating it with multiple layers of this complex Williamson organometallic composite, which will respond to magnetic fields and it will give you better performance in the particular deployment you desire to do, whether it's naval. It'll reduce corrosion rates, penetration of pollutants. It will also optimize the thickness naturally. It's a self-intelligent material. So how do we simulate this? We need equations. So the multiphysics is done with momentum, heat, temperature, and mass transfer concentration. You need boundary conditions, but then you have to solve the problem. And in this case, we had to use what's called the Keller Box Method, developed by the famous mathematician Herbert Keller at Caltech in the 1970s, because it's one of the most accurate ways to solve that kind of problem, better than ANSYS and a lot of other softwares. And then we have to characterize the problem. So you'll see here we've got things like Weisenberg number, which is for elastic effect to viscous effect, buoyancy ratio, Brownian motion for the nanoparticles that are embedded inside the coating. And then we can visualize this. Excuse me, if you increase the magnetic number, in other words, the magnetic force that's applied relative to the viscous force, you'll find that as you move along the cylinder, which is this coordinate xi, you will change the skin friction just by changing an external parameter. You can't do that with conventional means. This is why these are smart materials. And then you can visualize it as well in 2 dimensions and show the pattern. So not only can you do the multiphysics, but you can visualize it as well. And we used MATLAB to do the visualization for this. So we see significant modification along the cylinder is achieved by just changing one parameter, which is this parameter, the magnetic one, magnetic force divided by viscous force. And then you can look at things like heat transfer rates. How does heat move? So can that material be used for insulation purposes or as a fire protection mechanism, things known as intumescent materials? And what we found is that you can achieve that as well by manipulating the magnetic field. You can change the heat transfer rate. Massive manipulation is possible. And similarly, by changing the nanoparticles that are embedded inside it, you also get a dramatic change. So that sort of visualizes, the temperatures and the concentration of particles as well. All of this is achieved in multiphysics. And we also extended this by looking at the spin of the nanoparticles. We presented this work at Oxford a couple of years ago with Dr. Kadir and Dr. Koharat. And we used another model which wasn't available and still isn't available in MATLAB or ANSYS, which is known as Erringen's model. So what that model does when you're coating, it includes spin of the actual particles. This is not available in the standard Newtonian model or any other non-Newtonian model. The only way you can do it is by introducing what's called microelement gyration tensors, where the particle itself spins. And incidentally, this has a very dramatic effect also in blood flow. The reason that blood is efficient is because it has that mechanism. It's called the Larius-Fanquist effect, and it allows blood erythrocytes or blood cells to squeeze through very small gaps. That's how the microcapillary action works in the human circulation. But the only model that can do it in terms of multiphysics, without actually having to simulate every single particle, is the micropolar model. So this is the kind of work we did for that. Now, very quickly moving on to some of the projects we've supervised. In a postgraduate level, MSc and PhD, we've looked at things like flying cars using CFD, electromagnetic propulsion for spacecraft. Anwar did that a few years ago. We've looked at rocket functional graded materials, where you have metallic, ceramic composite layers for launch pads. Alex looked at carbon nanotubes in wing structures. All these projects were supervised by me. I'll share a few examples with you in due course. So this one was done by Subna Ravindran, who was very interested in landing gear, but specifically for spacecraft. When you're dealing with other planets, you've obviously got a different gravitational regime. So you need shock absorbers that are 10 to 20, if not 50 times more efficient than what you've got on a commercial jet. like a Boeing 757 or an Airbus 320. So to do that, we had to use electromagnetic nano-functional lubricants for the shock absorbers. And this actually was instrumental in getting Sabna a job. And now she works in the area of jet engine thermal coatings, but is also interested in moving forward into spacecraft. Another project was how to reinforce modern aircraft wings using nanotubes. So the Nobel Prize in Physics was won at Manchester in 2010 for graphene, which is a two-dimensional nanomaterial. If you wrap it into or roll it into 3 dimensions, you get a nanotube. This thing practically weighs nothing, but as you can see here, is approximately 100 times greater the strength than aluminium. Now, classically, aircraft were built out of aluminium in the start of the 20th century and were moved into composites really in the last 20, 30 years. But for sheer strength to weight ratio, there is nothing on Earth that can match nanomaterials. So this is why these are taking over now and producing more and more efficient structures. So Alex is now finishing his PhD. We've also looked at gas dynamics. So this was an area I actually got interested in by Dr. Leonard, who's a thermodynamicist, and the student was interested in the plume dynamics of a rocket. And this was simulated for his MSc project using ANSYS software. And we compared it with experiments which were conducted at NASA. And we got within 10–15% of their results, which is quite a good achievement and shows you that the simulation is quite good. A PhD example was Ali Kadir, who I supervised. He received his PhD last year, and you'll meet him later when he does the question and answer session. He studied novel nano coatings to protect gas turbine blades. And not only did he do experiments and show that the current technology in industry is lacking massively because they're not using nanoscale materials, they're using microscale materials or micro coatings. But he also computed erosion rates. All of this was done with multiphysics for a particular sample on one gas turbine blade with Rolls-Royce data. Dr. Kohara, as she is now, did an MSc project in solar nanocollectors, and she was interested in how you dope existing fluids like argon gases, which are inert, for long distance space missions. She also used ANSYS, and she showed that buoyancy effects, even in outer space where you get gravity changes when you go near different planets, can have a dramatic effect on the photovoltaic efficiency, but you have to solve the radiative heat transfer equation. So we've also done a lot of work with undergraduates. I won't read them all out, but a few examples are pipeline jet fire dynamics, quadcopter simulation, Nissan hybrid fuel cell simulation, and also magnetorheological actuated wind turbine blades. Last year, we ventured further into things like robotic swimming, where Agatha and Debbie looked at snake and manta-ray-inspired robots for monitoring the ocean, which is a very important part of the the planetary ecosystem. 70% of Earth is water. We have to look after our oceans. But we also looked at things like inner ear hydrodynamics and bioacoustics, because Hams was interested in hearing aid development. And this year we're looking at things like roller coaster vibration, delta wing shock aerodynamics of the Boom X1, which is a new commercial supersonic jet being built in Colorado, and magnetic vortex swirl engines, which Jennifer studied. And quickly to mention the work of Aaron, he looked at the solar sail, which uses radiation pressure from the sun to actually drive a spacecraft using the solar wind. The solar wind moves at 500 kilometers a second. That's approximately 1,500 times the speed of sound. It's an enormous velocity, and it can be harnessed by going into outer space, opening up this structure, and then building a sail, which can then propel the spacecraft. So this was done 5 years ago. It was called the Icarus project. Also, we looked at combustion simulation with Lola, who now works at Shell. And she simulated in ANSYS how a fireball expands, because it's a very major problem. And obviously, when you're dealing with the fuel industry. Other projects we'll be looking at in the future are spinal stress analysis, which Molly will be studying next year, and possibly snake swimming robots, butterflies. How have we communicated our work? Well, as Carl mentioned earlier, very briefly, some books I've published in the past. This one in particular allowed me to interface directly with one of my heroes based at Princeton, who I'll mention later. and introduced me to micropolar fluid dynamics, and the first book in the subject was written by me 10 years ago on computational methods in that area. Currently, we have a very good profile on Google Scholar, and this is an important part of how we disseminate our work to the international community. Some recent publications in renewable energy, we've simulated a new kind of solar pump using multiphysics, published it in Renewable Energy Journal, where we combine nanofluids, magnetohydrodynamics, and that peristaltic mechanism I was mentioning earlier, so that you can self-propel the fluid and replenish it without using a piston pump system. We've also explored things like ocean magnetic energy generation. This was inspired really by Faraday 2 centuries ago. But recently we've published work in ZAM, which is one of the world's leading journals in applied mathematics, founded by Richard von Mises and von Karman in the 1920s. And we've shown that by particular combinations of magnetic fields and materials, you can double the efficiency in an MHD, or magnetohydrodynamic energy generator. This work was done with Dr. Leonard. We've also looked at things like orthopedic lubrication for prosthetic replacement. If you've lost a knee, you can use magnetic rheological materials to build artificial legs. So there's a very diverse range of applications there. Also nanobots for cancer drug therapy. We've recently worked in this area where we're simulating the robot at a continuum level, not on a molecular level. And this can be done using multiphysics. Most recently, we've been looking at superparamagnetism, which is where the magnetic field intensity can switch very quickly, depending on temperature. And this can be used in laser hypothermia treatment in medicine. And again, magnetohydrodynamic energy generators using hydrogen gas, which is also growing popular. Targeted drug delivery, which I'm working with Dr. Kadir. And recently we've started looking at Taylor dispersion, which is where one material moves through another, a bit like bubble bath. In your, if you're taking a bath, you mix the bubble bath and it disperses through the hot water. This is known as mass transfer, but a specific mechanism that's important in medicine is called Taylor dispersion. So we've made some progress on that. Some of the work we did in computational medicine was rewarded last year when we won the first prize at the Materials of the Future Smart Conference in Qatar. They were very impressed with the work that we've done. So conclusions, basically, we're moving forward in these areas, and we're also exploring grants largely through the European Research Council with Vera Barron and Dr. Rachel Woolley. We're also expanding our research group. We've produced hundreds of articles, which you're all welcome to access on use of the University of Salford Institution repository. I have 11 cats, and many of them accompanied me when I prepared this presentation, notably Archie, who's very popular with my students because during COVID we've had to do MS Teams lectures and on Blackboard, so many students have met my cats. And we've tried, we're continuing to seek higher things in the spirit of Salford. That's our objective. Just to finish off, it's very important in order to inspire other people, which are our students and colleagues, one has to be inspired himself. So the people who inspired me in my life were Richard Feynman, the physicist, one of the greatest teachers of the 20th century, who coined the word nanotechnology. He was based at Caltech, legendary physicist. I recommend you watch his YouTube videos. I've also mentioned James Clerk Maxwell, another great hero of mine, who the Maxwell building is named after. And then finally, in the last 20 years, a major sort of mentor I've had is the first 10 years of the 21st century, died in 2009, was Professor Erringen, who revolutionized modern fluid mechanics. So the micropolar model I mentioned and the nanoscale models that we're using in our work were developed by this individual. So that concludes my presentation. I'll now pass it over to Dr. Ali Kadir, who will coordinate the question and answer session. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, please share them with Dr. Kadir and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Anwar. I wonder if anybody from the audience have any questions to ask Professor Anwar. For someone interested in FEA, CFD, multiphysics, how would you recommend someone to develop their future in this field, Professor Anwar?
I think it depends what level you're at. Basically, if you're still an undergraduate, learn as much as you can about the softwares that are available. And at Salford University, obviously, we have ANSYS. But also explore what you can from the internet, learn about other softwares. I mean, there's over 100 different softwares available internationally. There's Abacus, there's Adena, there's Star CD that does turbulent simulation. So there is no one software that does everything, but I think it's important to maybe watch videos on YouTube. And like Carl mentioned earlier, keep an open mind. Don't restrict yourselves just to one approach. So what I found in my life, I was very heavily involved in finite element simulation when I was a doctoral student, but I've explored other kinds of methods because not one method solves every problem. So I think if you have a flexible approach and also approach industry as well, in the sense that it doesn't intimidate you. You might be an aeronautical engineer, you might end up in the medical industry. There's still engineering industries and they will have specific softwares. But if you understand the methodology, I think that will set you in good stead for a very good future. And certainly an MSc degree, if you're an undergraduate, won't hurt your chances. And if you're interested in a PhD, you're welcome to join my group with Dr. Kadir. We'll be happy to supervise you if you're still a student.
Right. A question from Lisa saying, what has inspired you in your research in computational multiphysics simulation?
I think, to be honest with you, it's really nature. I mean, I started obviously as an undergraduate and I was learning you have to go through the ropes and learn the methodologies. But I think a lot of things have happened this century. And in one way, you could argue that the 20th century was about speed. It was about atomic science and things like that. The obsession was speed. But the 21st century is a different century. It's about biology. It's about sustainability. It's about putting back into nature what we've taken out. And I think this is what steered me more and more in my own work towards green initiatives or using intelligent mechanisms, that we see in nature and working in harmony with nature. And if you just think about how a human being breathes, for example, you take air in and then you breathe out. So the lungs expand and contract. They're in dynamic equilibrium. That's what nature's in. It's in a state of dynamic equilibrium, and we need to keep it in that state because this is where, for the foreseeable future, we're going to live for the rest of our lives. So it's very important, I think, to embrace that, what's happening in nature. That's what's inspired me.
Right. The next question is the last question, which is from Emily. It says, how do you see computing developing in the near future, and how can it help us engineers to do more complex simulation?
Right, I think there's two parts to that, Dr. Kadir. The first part is that before we even do computer simulation, we need to improve the experimental results that we've got. There's a very big misnomer in science and engineering that an experiment can't be wrong. I've personally done research in my life where somebody did an experiment 50 years ago and everyone in the world is trying to validate that experiment, and the experiment's wrong. Just because you do something in a laboratory doesn't mean it's right. It depends on the quality of the experiment and who did the experiment. Now, that particular experiment was done somewhere in Europe, but it was a benchmark for everybody else to model against. The experiment was wrong. So we have to be aware of that on the first point. The second point is that we have to be cognizant of the fact that computers are changing. Now, this goes back to what Feynman said in 1950. He's a very smart guy. He knew that the future was microscopic. It was miniaturization. And he also predicted that the existing computers would have to go through a quantum leap. In other words, quantum computing would have to design a different way in which equations are set up and the machine is put together. That's what we're waiting for, I think, because what we're finding is that the smaller and smaller you go, it just keeps getting more and more complex. So 100 years ago, you had Rutherford and the atom was split and everyone thought there was only a few particles. Then they've had a whole century of people discovering bosons and Higgs boson and fermions and all sorts of subatomic particles. But the deeper you go, the more complex it gets. So we need to remember that with improvements in experiments, and they should always be criticized. Yeah, you should not ever accept that just because somebody's done an experiment, it's 100% correct. No, you have to test that experiment, which is what we do in good science. And the improvement in computational hardware and also algorithms, I think, is what we're waiting for. Now, it might not happen in my generation, because I've crossed the golden line, as they say, Dr. Kadir. I'm over 50 now. But a lot of younger people who are watching are in their 20s. It may happen in your lifetimes, and we hope that it does. So I hope that's answered the question.
And that's the word also, say experiment. It doesn't mean it's going to be 100% accurate. The word
Exactly.
experiment, yeah.
Only as good as the person doing the experiment and the laboratory facilities. So people forget this.
And also, can I just add to that answer as well? I think the complex simulation, when you look at the actual drawing packages developed nowadays, you can actually transfer it into simulation package. And then that makes life a lot easier, because in the simulation package, it was a lot more difficult to do certain drawings. And now it can be brought from Solid or from AutoCAD into the finite element software. That makes the actual meshing and the element part of it and the running of the particular complex model, it will be a lot easier.
Absolutely, yeah. And one last point, Dr. Kadir, that when we're saying we're going to smaller and smaller scales, we've reached the nanoscale in our own work.
Yeah.
But that's 10 to the -9 meters. That's a billionth of a meter. But there are things happening at a smaller scale, like the pico scale and the femto scale.
Yeah.
We cannot actually simulate at that scale because the softwares we have don't have that level of resolution yet. We have to wait for those developments, and hopefully in the next 10 to 15 years, they will happen. And then we'll share them with you, hopefully, in another presentation, if you allow us that privilege.
I'm sorry, we don't have time to ask more questions, but I have one question. Have I got time to ask you that question? Yes, I have about 2 minutes, because I've got to go to another lecture, in a minute. Which area do you see expanding significantly in the 21st century for research and also career opportunities for graduates at Salford?
I think 2 areas. I think materials, number 1. This is a massive explosion now because of graphene, nanomaterials, pico materials, intelligent materials. And the second is this bioinspiration, where we're copying nature. These 2 things, I think, are very, very important for engineers and graduates in particular to think about, because this is what's influencing industry. The trends in industry now, for example, Boeing Aerospace has a $300 million project going on at the moment, where they're studying Amazonian frogs, because when it rains, the water falls off their bodies. So it eliminates the problem of having to de-ice an aircraft wing, because if the water can't stick to the wing, you can't have ice. So it's a different level of thinking, but it's inspired by nature. And I think that's something that all students should think about now in their futures.
But to create something like skin or something like that, you don't need to do stem cell technique in order to generate that kind of. That's another thing you need to combine.
Absolutely, yeah. So you can combine biology with bioinspiration, and I think that's the pathway for the future. That's what will happen in this century. That's what we hope to see.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for attending. We hope we've answered some of your questions. Obviously, we didn't have time to answer them all, but thank you again for attending. We hope that you've learned something about what we do at Salford and how we try to inspire our students to become the next generation of scientists. But that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you.